Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome. My name is Esau Williams, and this is The World We Got This, brought to you by the School of Global Affairs at King's College London. This week, our Lao China Institute has been holding its annual China Week with a series of events exploring the country's rise to superpower status, with this month also marking 75 years since the formation of the People's Republic of China. With China facing significant headwinds in its domestic economy, this year's theme explores what the future model for growth and development might look like and what challenges the country is facing today, particularly with the intensification of its rivalry with the United States. So, joining me to discuss these issues and what they mean for the rest of the world is our panel. We have Charlotte Goodburn, who is Deputy Director, Lao China Institute, and a reader in Chinese politics and development. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello.
Next, we have Jane Hayward, lecturer in China and Global Affairs at the Lao Institute. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much, Esau.
And Astrid Nordon is Lao Chair of Chinese International Relations. Hello, Astrid.
Hello, lovely to be here.
All right, and last and by no means least, Sean Kenji-Starrs, lecturer in development, or rather lecturer in the Department of International Development. Sean, welcome to you.
Thank you. Fantastic to be here.
Great. So we'll come to relations with the US in just a moment, but let's begin with the economy. So between 1979 and 2018, the Chinese economy has been a real juggernaut with an average annual GDP of 9.5%. Now, it lifted close to 800 million people out of poverty and has today become the world's second largest economy, second only, of course, to the United States. Now, one of the main drivers in this success was without doubt the creation of special economic zones, which are designed, of course, to attract foreign investment with favorable tax rates and other economic perks. So, for example, if you look at the region of Shenzhen, it was an unremarkable coastal town of just about 30,000 people before becoming the focal point of the first special economic zone. Today, it's one of the biggest cities in China and home to the technology giants such as Huawei and Tencent, with a GDP rivaling Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. Many other countries have eyed the success of China's economic zones, and it's been touted as a model for other developing nations to copy. But will that model translate? Well, Charlotte, let's begin with you. You've just released some research looking at the success of these zones in Africa, not China, but in Africa. And perhaps you could briefly tell us a little more about the zones in China and how they've worked there and why they've become so successful.
Yes, thank you very much. So Shenzhen being the classic example of a Chinese zone that was very successful, as you've just mentioned. I think it's important to say a little bit about the context in which Shenzhen and the other three initial zones were established in China in 1980. So before 1978, China had practically zero foreign direct investment and very low levels of foreign trade as well. And when the country opened its doors to the world economy in 1980, these special economic zones were kind of experimental test beds for the market economy that was going to be necessary for a gradual economic liberalization in China. Basically, a special economic zone, an SEZ, is a kind of specially designated area that has different economic regulations compared to the rest of the country where it's based. It's like a little extraterritorial enclave. And it might have tax incentives and lower tariffs for foreign investors. And in China, these four first special economic zones that were set up were really very experimental in the sense that they had an extremely different system compared with the rest of China in 1980. So things like the Chinese government protected private property rights in zones, unlike in the rest of China until 2004. And they introduced a new contract labor system so that workers could be hired and fired. And they allowed investors to develop and use land for their businesses, even though under Chinese law, all urban land belonged and still belongs to the state. And it also introduced a lot of things like tax incentives for foreign enterprises and customs exemptions. So these zones were really very attractive to foreign firms who started to move their manufacturing there. They didn't take off immediately. They started by attracting kind of small-scale investment, mostly from Hong Kong and Taiwan in the early 80s. But by the 1990s, they were very successful. And I think there was a World Bank report sort of a few years ago that suggested something like 25% of China's national GDP was accounted for by these SEZs, and something crazy like 60% of China's exports and millions of jobs. So they've been hugely successful. But the thing that I really wanted to say is that we need to remember when we think about these zones, and particularly when we think about translating them for other places, as you just said, is that the Chinese special economic zones were really unique. Beside those things that I already mentioned, there were really China-specific and context-specific factors. And the biggest one was that foreign firms couldn't invest anywhere else in China. If they wanted to access China's cheap, abundant labor, they had to go into the SEZs at that time. They were very strategically located to get investment from Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan, and that's where the early investments came from. They have massive state investment in their infrastructure very rapidly, and also in bringing in labor from the former production brigades. And the final thing, the global situation in the 1980s and 1990s, this kind of temporal factor in the success of the zones is that it was just that time when firms in rich countries were starting to look for a cheaper way to manufacture their products with avoiding high labor costs, and China was perfect for that. So these are the conditions that were really quite unique to China that allowed the SEZs to take off.
So stay with you, Charlotte, then. I mean, you've been looking at some zones that have been set up in Africa, presumably with the help of China, briefly.
Yeah, that's right. So we've just finished a large grant project in which we've identified, categorized and analyzed 50 economic development zones across Africa that have got some kind of association with China. It doesn't mean that they're all Chinese owned. Some have been constructed by China but funded by the host country or financed by Chinese loans. Some are wholly or partly owned by the Chinese state or by some Chinese private firms. There's a really wide diversity of these zones and the kinds of connections that they have to China.
If what you said earlier on then is the case that these zones are set up with Chinese sort of uniqueness in mind, in terms of they're very specific to China's own system and culture, these things being replicated elsewhere, including in Africa, could be problematic.
Yes, that's exactly it. So what we've done has been looking at the impacts of these zones. A lot of the countries, when they want to set up a zone, they approach China for a zone. It's not the other way around. China isn't suggesting them, as far as we can tell. They think they're going to replicate Chinese success. So they think they're going to turn it into Shenzhen. But the zones that we have looked at, we find quite a big gap between these promotional narratives that are put forward by China and the host country state, saying they're going to create millions of jobs, they're going to boost all these exports. And in reality, what is happening on the ground, it's not that the zones are not working. You know, many of them are making quite meaningful contributions to the national and local economy, but they're not going to be transformative. They're not going to be the next Shenzhen. That's very clear.
Sean, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think I want to emphasize Charlotte's point about the timing. So we've had, the explosion of globalization in the 1990s, where Western corporations were moving a lot of manufacturing to East Asia, but obviously particularly China. So China became workshop of the world by 2001 when it joined the WTO. The global situation is extremely different now. So you've had the rise of right-wing populism in the West that no longer wants to ship every job to China, Mexico, and so on. And so China rose because of manufacturing, right? So that was the main driver. Now, what a lot of the production that China is starting up in Africa is related to natural resources. So it's kind of different. And a lot of African countries have a trade deficit with China. So they're exporting natural resources to China, and China's exporting manufactured goods to Africa. And so that might lead to deindustrialization in Africa. And so it's a different relationship, whereas Western firms actually did move their production to China. So it's a different growth driver. And, the West, and especially the United States, of course, is no longer interested in free trade. And there's much more competition now. I mean, India is also trying to get some of the manufacturing from China. So there's a lot more competition now for Africa.
And Charlotte, if I can come back to you, we oftentimes, when we hear of the fact that Chinese businesses are making great strides across the world, there is that linkage with the Chinese state. Is that a fair one?
So some of the zones that we've looked at and some of the businesses are connected with the Chinese state, nationally or subnationally, or Chinese state-owned enterprises. But a lot are not. A lot are set up by Chinese private firms, individuals, some are really small scale. There's a huge diversity. So that's one of the key things I wanted to emphasize, is that it's very difficult to talk about Chinese zones. They're very different. There are many different kinds, and they have very different impacts, actually, in terms of the way they're run, the way they're managed, in terms of the level of agency and involvement for the host country, African nation. These are very, very variable.
So the fact that these special economic zones are being replicated elsewhere, for example, in Africa, presumably with Chinese support, but sometimes not, does that then mean that China can also learn about a system that it's so accustomed to working elsewhere and possibly use that as a means of leveraging further economic activity around the world?
So it's complicated. I think that we have to be a bit clear what we mean when we say China. So a lot of these zones are not Chinese state run. They might be Chinese private firms. So it's not necessarily feeding back to the Chinese state. But I think it is fair to say that the zones, in as far as they are successful and create jobs and some sort of meaningful economic contribution, they do boost Chinese relations with the host countries, and they contribute to positive perceptions and engagement. But of course, the zones also often have a lot of negative effects. So the one thing that our report really looks into is the kind of social, environmental type repercussions for local people, food security, urbanization, massive influxes of migrant labor, not from China, I mean internally within the country. All these kind of things tend to get overlooked when people talk about zones. They were there in the Chinese model, actually. We saw these kinds of things happening in China, but they might be side effects that perhaps the host country nations didn't expect or weren't planning to have as a result of their zones. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to highlight in the research is this idea that the host countries, given that they're not going to have this kind of transformative development that China had, it's not going to turn them all into Shenzhen and make them everybody rich. They need to pay a lot more attention to mitigating some of these, or at least planning for some of these side effects of the zones. And some of those are not unique to Chinese zones. So they're not, contributing to a particular relationship between China and the host country necessarily. They're just side effects of what happens when you set up these large industrial zones. Things like you're going to get a lot of migrant labor, and then you're going to get urbanization. And the local people might not like that. And they might, move out of agriculture, and you might have problems with food security. So all these kinds of things need thinking about beyond just the economic dimensions that are hitting the headlines in terms of China's relations with these countries.
Just looking at it from a sort of a broad perspective, Charlotte, do these special economic zones keep sort of Chinese labor in certain regions of the country? It prevents people from moving to the cities, to the Beijings and the Shanghais to, take up work there.
You mean the zones inside China itself?
Correct.
Yes, so there have historically been a lot of restrictions on migrant labor in China. There's now a whole proliferation of different kinds of zones in China, right? So there were 4 SEZs that came up in 1980. Since then, China's got a whole load of small development zones, free trade zones, all kinds of little, economic zones of one kind or another. There is a lot of migration. Shenzhen is the classic example of an SEZ that saw huge migration, obviously from the 80s. But where China is actually restricting migrant labor coming in is the megacities. So now Shenzhen is one of those. Those cities with this population over 5 million, 10 million, those are very difficult for migrant labor to come into. They can come temporarily for work, of course, but very difficult for them to settle down and get access to social services, social security, state resources in the same way that the permanently registered population has. Now, that's not necessarily connected with the zones. That's just a more general problem across China's megacities.
In Africa, what can they learn directly from the Chinese experience economically?
That's a great question. I think probably the main thing in terms of what China did right that could potentially be replicated in some of the African cases is the massive investment in infrastructural development. It's going to be very hard for African countries to do that, but it's more replicable than, taking us back to the 1980s or 90s or being close to Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan and those kind of factors. So the one thing that the zones really need in terms of China's economic development is that state investment in infrastructural development. You need roads, you need water, you need electricity, you need phone lines, you need internet, you need data. You need these things to be installed very rapidly. When we talk to firms that have been invested in these zones, that was a huge source of frustration for them, that they've come here to this zone and actually the infrastructure is not in place there. The logistics to get their goods out of the zone and get them exported are not really in place. So that's one thing that China clearly did very, very right with its own zones experience. But it's very hard for other developing countries to put that in place. In part, that's why they're setting up zones, because they can't put all the rest of that infrastructure in place across the country. They can only concentrate it in a small area. And as soon as you've got a good that you need to leave that zone, your product, you're stuck with local roads, you're stuck with local infrastructures, and that's going to be very difficult.
Doesn't that also turn the development argument on its head, Charlotte, given the fact that with the absence of infrastructure, the roads, the communication systems, the networks that actually filled the countryside into the cities and also to the ports to export and gain hard, badly needed foreign currency, that those themselves, by their very nature, provide the opportunities for Africa's youth, for people in Africa to get jobs in, to build that infrastructure, to build those roads, no?
Yes, but that would involve quite significant state investment. So I suppose one of the things that's appealing about setting up a special economic zone with Chinese funding is that you're getting the funding from China for the zone. It reduces the amount of investment by the host state. If the host state were, had the funds available to do this kind of investment, then absolutely, that sort of infrastructure would be wonderful and might also provide jobs beyond the zone, in the areas around the zone. But that's very difficult, I think, for many of those countries to provide on a broader basis than just inside the zone itself. And that's a real weakness. And it puts firms off from investing. They don't want to come to a zone if they then can't actually export efficient manner from that zone. So lots and lots of the zones are not boosting exports. They might be creating jobs, but it's very hard to export the products that are created there.
And presumably as well, Charlotte, that many of the African countries, because China doesn't harp on about democracy and the rule of law in terms of, using that as a pretext for giving aid, that many countries that are run by not so quote unquote democratic forces are happy to do business with China than, say, the United States or Britain.
I don't know if I would have put it that way. Certainly when we did field work for this project in Nigeria and in Uganda, and certainly the general word that we heard from locals that we interviewed and officials was that they don't want to be involved with the US model. They think the US model of development has failed. They think China offers a very nice alternative model of development, not just because, it ignores international norms and not because of those kinds of things, but actually because it developed very rapidly from a very low base itself. China has been a developing country, has overcome a lot of hurdles in a very short space of time. The thing we heard over and over again in official interviews was, we've tried the US model. We've had years and years of doing that. It hasn't worked. It hasn't brought us development. It's time to try the Chinese model. We can see it works because they've done it in China. So we're now keen to do it their way. So I don't know if it's so much about the nature of the Chinese state, although of course that is obviously a factor, but there's a very strong perception among policymakers and those we interviewed that the US model has failed or has not brought anything very successful to these African nations.
Charlotte Goodburn, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. And we'll be discussing US-China relations, of course, in light of the forthcoming American election. But after the break, we'll be turning our attention to China's ghost cities.
Está escuchando
Unasikiza kunsoraran. You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
Welcome back. Now, since COVID, the Chinese economy has struggled to hit its previous highs. And even prior to COVID, one of the biggest drags on the economy has been its construction sector, where a staggering 65 million apartments and houses still sit empty years after being built. Jane, it's your turn. So let's come to you and let's discuss. First of all, tell us how all these empty homes came to be there in the first place.
Thanks, Esau. So let me talk a bit about how the construction sector came to be such an important part of China's economy to begin with. So the construction sector is actually what kept China's economy going after the financial crisis hit in 2008. That was a real disaster for China, certainly initially, because China's economy was largely based on exports and manufacturing, and a huge amounts of jobs were manufacturing jobs. And when people in other countries, particularly the United States, were hit by the financial crisis, they stopped buying goods coming from China. And so basically the job that hit China's job market incredibly badly. So the Chinese policymakers, basically, they switched to the construction industry. They made a decision, we're going to really boost the construction industry to keep growth going and to create lots of jobs. So they allowed lots and lots of loans to go to local governments, largely from the major state banks, but also they supplemented these loans from commercial banks, and they set up these really strange companies called local government finance vehicles. And they were able to get more commercial loans from banks, and they were able to issue bonds themselves. So they got more and more and more money. And in particular, a lot of this money from the local government finance vehicles was off book. That means it enabled these local governments to get more loans than they were sort of technically allowed to. So there was huge amounts of money going into construction projects, and that's what massively fueled the construction boom all over the country. So partly the goal was to keep the economy going at this time of crisis and create jobs for people. But at the same time, there's this really strong ideological belief, really, that we find in China. We also find in many countries. It's not unusual at all. It's very, very sort of actually quite general in development thinking globally, which is that modernization means urbanization. And China has a massive rural population. So the idea was, if you build lots and lots of urban buildings, this will really help China to modernize, because you can move lots of these rural villages into these buildings, and that will solve a lot of China's problems and help China to develop. So really these two things are going on at the same time, the ideological belief and this drive to keep the economy going. And what you wind up with is massive construction projects and an awful lot of buildings.
But also too, Jane, I mean, it's almost counterintuitive, isn't it? It's totally counterintuitive in the sense that you have a country of billions of people. You've got millions of apartments sitting empty. China's basically become a victim of its own success, you'd say.
Victim? I'd stay away from the word victim, I think. They certainly were. And this is, I think they get criticized a lot for having all these ghost cities all over the place. And people talk about, this being sort of a very irrational part of China's economy. But actually, as you say, they are there because they were able to ride out the global financial crisis more successfully than other countries. And this is, in a sense, the result of that. So, sorry, they're a victim of their own success. Well, it is a result of their own success and a rather unusual and unexpected outcome, yes.
What is it about the Chinese business model, then, that replicates such infrastructure at almost breakneck speed?
Partly through decentralization and incentivizing these governments. So one thing that has been going on is an incentive structure for local officials, which I'm sure went sort of into, was very much accelerated after the global financial crisis, but it's been around for decades, actually. Local officials are promoted based on a number of criteria, and one of the main criteria for a long time has been, can you promote growth in your local area? Which is largely why so many government officials got behind these projects to the extent they did. And also, can you maintain social stability in your local area? And part of that is maintaining jobs. So that's one reason why the urbanization drive also took off the way it did. There's also a lot of capital interests in terms of real estate. The real estate companies got behind this. There's a lot of people with, a lot of investment interests in the real estate, and sort of all of this combined together to produce this outcome.
So what's been the mood in China itself about these ghost cities? What are people saying? What are their views about them?
Well, one of the big surprises really is that why aren't people moving into these cities the way that they were expected? And I think there's a lot of discussion about that, and a lot of policymakers and researchers, economic researchers in universities are studying this issue right now and trying to figure out what's happened. And from the papers that I've been reading, it seems that, well, it's a very complicated issue, but there are three things that are going on. One of them is that a lot of people would actually love to move out of the countryside, but they simply don't have high enough incomes to be able to do it. And they may also, not have high enough skill level or educational levels to be able to sustain a job in a city, even if they could buy a house there. Another aspect of this is that a lot of people might want to move to a city, but they're very hesitant to do so because they may not see very good job prospects if they move to an urban city, but they do have rural land. If you're staying in the countryside, if you're still a member of the village, you have right to a patch of land that basically it's collective land rights in the village, but you have a right to your own plot of land, or at least your household does, as long as you're still a member of that village. Now, people may not want to give that up, partly because it's a form of economic security in itself, and also partly because a number of people are thinking, if a developer comes along and wants to urbanize my village, develop my village, I could get a real windfall from this patch of land that I have. And a lot of people, I think, are hesitant to give up that possible future opportunity. Now, they would lose that if they were to move to the city. City sizes is a real issue here. There's lots of smaller cities, and the smaller cities, a lot of them have far less job prospects. but a lot of the cities are really large, like, for example, Shanghai and Beijing. Now, lots of people actually would love to move to those cities, even if it would be to, have a really, in inverted commas, low-level job, like setting up a street stall or something like that. But the trouble is there are a lot of policies at the moment coming from the central government which want to keep migrant workers out of these cities and preserve them really for the wealthy and middle classes. So there's a lot of debates going on at the moment in Chinese policy circles about whether or not we should let rural migrants from the countryside come into these cities, set up street stalls, and give them access to the larger cities that way, or if we should continue to keep them out.
And I'll let in Sean in a moment, but that question also, Jane, basically comes straight out of my mouth. You just mentioned that because I'm just thinking in terms of the sort of peasants, those in the rural areas and those in the city, almost sets up the argument that can be traced as far back as Karl Marx. And obviously the Communist Party of today's China is a world apart from that in terms of its ideology.
That's right. So Marx sort of came up with this. Marx is really central to his idea of the development of capitalism, which he really based on development in England, is that peasants, as they would have been called in feudal times, are basically kicked off the land by an enclosure movement. They lose their access to the land. They wind up in the cities because they have no choice to be there. What you then get is an army of industrial workers. That fuels the development of capitalism. And Marx thought that a communist society would eventually develop out of the antagonistic relationship between an army of low-paid industrial workers and the bourgeoisie. So in other words, the factory owners that they were working for. So what you had at the turn of the 20th century was a lot of socialist thinkers who wanted this communist revolution to happen, looking at the countrysides in the various countries where they were, thinking, basically looking out to see if the peasantry was in fact disappearing. What you have now in China is sort of the opposite to that, which is that we thought the peasantry were going to disappear and they haven't to the extent that we thought. So now what do we do with them? How do we organize them?
And Sean, briefly, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with everything Jane said there, particularly the pressures of provincial governments to drive economic growth, and that often is building real estate infrastructure. But I also want to add that there's also just normal capitalist processes where wealthy people buy up apartments for investment, and which happens in London, happens in New York, Toronto, and many other global cities. So there's probably not 65 million empty apartments in the West, but there's quite a few. Anyone who walks in any rich area in a global city with that's open to foreign capital, there's a lot of dark apartment buildings.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane, for that and your quick contribution, Sean. Now, let's take a quick break and then we'll return to the question of the Trump-Harris election and what their result would mean for relations with China and what those relations in turn would mean for the rest of the world.
Du hører på.
ನೀವು ಕೇಳುತ್ತಿರುವುದು
You are listening to the World We Got This podcast.
Welcome back. Now, Americans go to the polls on November the 5th in a presidential race that, according to the polls, could come down to just one or two swing states. So at this stage, it's impossible to predict who will be the next US president. But what would a Trump or a Harris victory mean for relations between China and the United States? Well, with candidates likely to take very different views on key issues such as trade or Taiwan, how will the Chinese respond to either leader? Well, let's turn now to Astrid. Let's begin by finding out what you're hearing from the United States in terms of what the candidates' regard for China is and on those key issues that inform US-Chinese relations.
Thank you very much, Esau. I think there are few things on which there is broad agreement in US politics today, but a suspicious, defensive, and rather hawkish stance on China is one of them. You phrase it really nicely because you say, what do we hear from the candidates? And part of the answer is we hear a lot from Trump about China, and we hear quite little from Harris on that topic.
What do you think that is?
I think China is not a key priority for voters. they know what to expect from Trump in a strange kind of way because they've seen him in power, whereas Harris does not have as much recognition or understanding from the broader US public, and therefore she needs to focus more closely on some key issues like the development of the economy and a lot of other issues that are higher up on the list of priorities for the US electorate. Trump, on the other hand, is more well known on those issues and is tethering himself a lot to drumming up a very particular kind of nationalism. And in that story, China as a scapegoat is very useful indeed.
As far as China being a scapegoat on the Trump campaign and in terms of his posture towards Beijing already known, I mean, Harris has been around the Biden presidency for the last 3+ years. Again, why aren't we getting as much from the Biden White House as we did from the Trump White House in terms of relations with China and China being such a superpower?
No, I mean, I think from the Biden White House, we've heard a lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Harris will continue that or that she is talking about it as part of her electoral campaign. So Trump is talking a lot about China. I think BBC did this wonderful article where they counted how many times Trump had talked about China in biggest part of September, and it was more than 40 times. And for Harris, I think it was 1. So Trump is hosting roundtables specifically about China. He said a lot about what he's going to do. He's talked about tariffs up to 60%. He's talked about a lot of this focus on tension and painting China as an economic predator. He talks about China as a place to blame for COVID. He talks about stopping Chinese cars from selling in the US. And he's warned China not to replace the US dollar as a world reserve currency as well. And of course, some of those things he did put in action in his previous presidency. Now, Harris has been quiet, but of course she has also been part of the White House that has pursued its own policies. I think we can see the continuation of a lot of Biden's presidential initiatives, including putting up some of those tariffs that Trump originally launched during his term in power. When she's talked about China very briefly in response to questions, she said that she'll take swift and strong measures when China undermines the rules of the road.
Right. So let me turn to Sean right now. Do you think either of those postures that Astrid has just enunciated, so for example, the Trump presidency being very sort of muscular in its approach to Beijing and the Harris much more muted, do you think those two positions will hold post November the 5th?
So I actually wouldn't characterize it like that. I think there's very little difference between Trump, Biden, and Harris. I mean, Harris has basically said she'll continue the Biden policies in terms of global affairs.
But they're not slapping tariffs on everything that comes from China, are they?
Well, so Biden is the one that slapped 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So they definitely are expanding. So not only did Biden keep all of Trump's tariffs, but he expanded them. And then he massively expanded the tech war against Chinese advanced technology. So not just chips, but also artificial intelligence, supercomputers, quantum computing, and so on. So I actually think Biden doubled down on a lot of Trump's policies, despite Biden being a free trade warrior for half a century. So I think there's bipartisan support in the national security establishment that we need to change U.S. foreign policy towards China permanently. So, of course, from Nixon until Obama, there was more or less a accommodationist stance towards China, like trying to accommodate and bring China into global capitalism. But they assumed that that there would also be a political change. But I think it's clear that they think it's clear that there hasn't been, and so there's bipartisan support for this. So I don't think there's going to be any change. In fact, I just came back from a workshop yesterday in the U.S. There's a lot of very interesting people. So there was a person from the Center for New American Security. There was an executive from Intel Corporation. There was a senior advisor in the Bureau of Industry and Security of the Department of Commerce, which is the body that's devising the export controls, and a number of others. And all of them actually think they're all liberals except for maybe one of them, but all of them are worried that Trump will be too soft on China because they think that Trump has a tendency to negotiate with so-called dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping. And actually, Trump did offer Xi Jinping an off-ramp to the tariffs in 2020, in January 2020. They negotiated an off-ramp, whereas Biden is not negotiating an off-ramp because he's recharacterized this as a battle between democracy versus autocracy. So that's a fundamental difference in basically not allowing Xi Jinping an off-ramp, and because they want to fundamentally change the character of China to a liberal democracy.
Indeed. Let me come to Astrid quickly and briefly. Do you think to President Xi, it matters who wins in the US? Who would he prefer, do you think?
So, first of all, I agree with what Sean just said. I was trying to answer your question about what the candidates are saying, and Trump is saying a lot and Harris is saying a little. That doesn't necessarily mean, or I don't think it means, that they will be particularly different. I think the bipartisan agreement in how to approach China is remarkable given how little else the parties agree on. Now, how does that then resonate in China? I think there is no clear preference, but the two candidates are scary for different reasons, right? So on the one hand, I think when Trump was elected, and even more so when he lost to Biden and started to question and undermine the democratic system, I think Xi Jinping took the weekend off, right? My work here is done. I no longer need to be this big proponent for trying to convince people that democracy is a very recent and pretty rubbish system that's not going to last. Donald Trump's doing that for me. On the other hand, I think he also thinks that Trump feeds in quite nicely to a lot of his narratives, right? So Donald Trump's really aggressive rhetoric and all this talk about China feeds a Communist Party narrative, which portrays China as the victim of foreign bullies. And Trump lends excellent evidence to the fact that this is the case and that the Chinese people need the Communist Party to protect them against those bullies. But he's quite fickle, right? People don't really know where Donald Trump stands. That's quite difficult for any leader to deal with. Harris, on the other hand, is seen as more stable, perhaps in a sense predictable, even though she's less well known, but also perhaps more stable on some of the key flashpoints, including over Taiwan, where there might be a bigger concern about what Trump could be doing, and that's less understandable.
Thank you. Let me bring in Sean on that, because exactly on Taiwan, which is the world's biggest producer of semiconductors, which is needed in almost every electronic device on the planet, how sensitive is that area, and how could the issue of the volatility of trade from Taiwan influence Chinese international relations?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely sensitive. I mean, Xi Jinping has said in many speeches that China and Taiwan, must reunify. I mean, he regards Taiwan as a renegade province, and whether by force or not, especially I think his deadline is 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. I personally don't think that China has the capacity to actually invade Taiwan. I mean, certainly China has the capacity to do an economic blockade of Taiwan, which they basically already did for a few days when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan a few years ago. But so that lasted for about 4 days, I think, something like that, or 3-4 days. So they can certainly do that, but and that would be a disaster. But I don't think it would come to that because China is not offering that much pushback against the U.S. increasing its military relations with Taiwan. I mean, the U.S. continues to sell, advanced fighter jets and so on to Taiwan.
Thanks, Sean, for that. Just before we end the podcast, I know that Charlotte is about to run. So just very quickly, just in a word or two, tell us what you're going to be watching over the next few days and weeks as far as China-Africa is concerned.
We're very excited that we are launching not only our report from the project, but also a toolkit for policymakers in African countries. So we're going to be looking for feedback from that. It's an online toolbox to help people think through whether they should set up these kinds of zones with support from China and how to mitigate some of the potentially negative side effects that might come about from that. So the only thing I'm really going to be watching in the next couple of weeks in the China-Africa sphere is to see what kind of feedback we get on that and whether it's going to be useful to the policymakers.
Very good. Charlotte Goodburn, thank you very much. Deputy Director of Lao China Institute and Reader in Chinese Politics and Development here at King's College London. Thank you for your time and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, let me quickly go back to Sean just before we end the podcast. And when you look at the situation with Taiwan, for example, you mentioned earlier that it's a very sensitive one with China. Do you also think that events in faraway Ukraine and Russia, as far as that conflict is concerned, the way that conflict is decided, the way it ends, will also inform China's views on possible designs towards Taiwan, do you think?
Maybe, but I think one of the main lessons from that episode is that China hasn't really militarily assisted Russia. So despite the BRICS, despite the no limits friendship that they announced before the invasion in early 2022, I think early February and so on, China has actually followed a lot of the U.S. sanctions. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is supposed to be an alternative to the IMF, also cut off dollar financing to Russia, right? Because Chinese state-owned enterprise banks also do not want to be cut off from the Wall Street system, from global finance. So, and Huawei and ZTE have more or less, especially since they've been the target of U.S. lawfare, they have more or less followed U.S. sanctions, and so. So much for BRICS solidarity. I mean, so that to me suggests that China does not feel that it's ready to push back on the U.S. militarily.
And before we go, let me ask you what you're going to be watching over the next few days and weeks, Sean, briefly.
The person I talked to a few days ago from the Bureau of Industry and Security said that they are designing more export controls on semiconductors to make it tighter. So I will be eagerly waiting what sort of loopholes are closing and so on.
And Astrid, what are you going to be keeping your eyes on over the next few days and weeks yourself?
Well, I'm going to be looking at the massive amounts of exciting conversations we're going to be having at China Week, which is continuing this week. And I'm really looking forward to the closing event with Fuchsia Dunlop, where we're going to be talking about Chinese food and politics and different understandings of the world through those things.
Excellent plug there. And finally to you, Jane, what will you be watching?
There are always interesting stories coming out about China's economy and real estate. So that's what I'll be watching. And I'm no doubt that there will be lots of surprises coming up over the next few months.
I'm sure there will be. Well, that's all the time for this episode of World We Got This. On the panel this week, we had Charlotte Goodburn, Jane Hayward, Astrid Nordon, and Sean Kenji-Starrs. My name is Esau Williams, and I'm at the School of Global Affairs, King's College in London. Do join us again next time for another edition of World We Got This. Thank you for your company. Goodbye.